What the fuck? Shen Qingqiu wasn't freaking out over the other person's face. That would have been better, because the problem was that the youth outside the door, his face, was a fucking blur, like it had been censored with a mosaic. Memo had told him from the start that there would be a chance of blurred faces and fragmented memories. But now that it had really happened, Shen Qingqiu felt the burning urge to cough up blood anyway. Great Master Memo, can't you take just a little time to fix this bug? I really want to know what his face looks like. Right as Shen Qingqiu was preparing to charge out the door to see if closing the distance could get rid of the mosaic, the memory cut off again. This time, the setting was the study. Young Master Qiu was writing at his desk when Shen Jiu stood at his side, grinding ink for him. Shen Jiu at this time was still a frail-looking youth, though he'd grown in height and could be considered tall and slender compared to others his age. As he stood there serving young Master Qiu, the air of an aloof scholar drifted about him. As the paper neared completion, Shen Jiu said submissively, "Young Master, there's something..." Young Master didn't lift his eyes. "Is it about that martial arts world scam artist?" "Senior Wu Yangzi isn't a martial world scam artist," Shen Jiu replied. Young Master Qiu put away his pen and frowned. "All you need to do is stay here and behave yourself. Do your part as brother-in-law and live your peaceful life with my sister. What's the point of all those wild fantasies?" After a stretch of silence, Shen Jiu suddenly gritted his teeth. "Live my life, live my life. I don't want to live that kind of life." Young Master Qiu finally raised his eyes and sent Shen Jiu a glance, then suddenly kicked the back of his knee. Shen Jiu fell face first onto the floor with a thud. Shen Qingqiu couldn't help but rub at his own perfectly uninjured leg. Had the two of them followed this pattern all through these years? Young Master Qiu rose from his seat with a mocking smile. "To think that the times I spent teaching you over the years, everything you've learnt, couldn't compare to a martial arts world scam artist's crooked little tricks." Shen Jiu's nose was bloody, but he raised his head and sneered back with an air of arrogance. "They're not crooked little tricks. They're immortal techniques. An ordinary talentless person like you can only comfort yourself by calling him a martial scam artist." Young Master Qiu crouched down and grabbed a handful of Shen Jiu's hair. "Immortal techniques?" he asked, tone affectionate. "A piece of trash like you actually wants to cultivate to immortality?" Shen Jiu averted his gaze, wanting to avoid young Master Qiu's hand, but the latter only patted his forehead slowly, the action full of ridicule. Smiling, he said, "You don't even count as human, and you want to be immortal?" Shen Jiu held his head and remained silent. Seeing that Shen Jiu had wilted, young Master Qiu gentled his action some, his tone heartfelt. "What's wrong with staying here and behaving yourself? Just earnestly doing your duties. You're already 15, no longer young and even about to be married. The best time for cultivating has long since passed you by. What's there to cultivate? If you stupidly leave with him, he might not even want you." Digging his own grave! Young Master Qiu was really digging his own grave. What the original flavor Shen Qingqiu cared about more than anything in his life was his cultivation. He couldn't stand anyone being better than him and could tolerate others speaking ill of it even less. Otherwise, he wouldn't have hated and envied Luo Binghe to the point of insanity. And this dumbass had actually dared to say that he was without prospects. Shenjiu violently flung out his arm, grabbed the inkstone on the desk, and hurled it at Young Master Qiu. From this angle, it also looked like he launched it at Shenjin Qiu, who unconsciously ducked to the side. The inkstone failed to hit him, of course, and it didn't strike Young Master Qiu either, but it did splatter the Young Master's bottom half with a good amount of black ink, completely ruining his beautifully embroidered robe. Young Master Qiu's face immediately fell. "Donghwa's fondness for you is several lives worth of fortune for you," he shouted. "If it weren't for our family, you'd still be on the streets even now, playing a beggar and swindling for a living. That you don't lack for clothes, that you can even read and write when you're only pretended trash. Who gave that all to you?" He slapped Shenjiu's head into the floor. "Utter ingrate!" Shenjiu seemed ready to burn all his bridges. "Human," he said viciously. "Why should I be grateful towards a beast?" What admirable courage! With a single strike, Young Master Qiu flung Shenjiu into the wall. "And I thought you've made some progress these past few years, but of course, a piece of shit can't be polished." Upon the white wall hung a sword. When Shenjiu slammed into the wall, the blade fell to the ground. As he sat splayed against the wall, his hand touched the sword. He drew it in his panic and held it in his trembling hands, pointing it at Young Master Qiu with bloodshot eyes. The Young Master didn't for an instant believe that Shenjiu would actually use the weapon. "Still quite the temper you have," he said, pointing back at him. "Your bone's itching for another beating." As he came several steps closer, Shenjiu's soul almost fled his body in terror. "You good-for-nothing, you." After that Young Master Qiu was no longer able to speak. He slowly lowered his head. The sword had been thrust straight into his stomach. Young Master Qiu's face was full of disbelief as Shenjiu wrenched the sword out. Meanwhile, on the side, Shenjin Qiu felt a conflicted kind of thrill. Fuck! This was streaming live from the scene of the murder! The situation had changed in the blink of an eye. A couple of short words, and the incident unfolded. Shenjiu was frozen. Young Master Qiu covered his stomach with one hand, then forcefully snatched the sword away with the other. He kicked Shenjiu to the floor and screamed. Shenjiu quickly threw himself forward and throttled Young Master Qiu by the neck. While they struggled and fought, several guards rushed in. The moment they laid eyes upon the scene in the study, they began to yell. Both panicked and terrified, Shenjiu formed some kind of seal, and the sword in Young Master Qiu's hand shot forward, going straight through the chests of several guards. He turned his head again to see Young Master Qiu staggering towards him, crimson-stained hand moving to grab his hair. Shenjiu sent the sword at him once more, this time piercing his lung. He followed up with stab after stab, using all his strength. Shenjiu's thrusts became increasingly vicious, and his expression increasingly savage. Only after more than 50 stabs, by which point the corpse's face and vital organs had been reduced to a mess of blood and gore, did Shenjiu finally stop, panting. This was probably Shenjiu's first time killing a person, and on top of that, the first time he'd used his own spiritual energy to do so. Having witnessed the incident in its entirety, Shenjin Qiu was stunned. Such a brutal first time! For a while, Shenjiu stood dumbfounded at the room full of corpses. Then he suddenly came back to himself, the sword falling from his hands with a clatter. As if his senses had left him entirely, he paced back and forth within the study, subconsciously wiping his hands on his clothes over and over. However, his mind was only gone for a moment before he managed to compose himself at a shockingly swift speed. The entire shift in emotional state had taken less than a minute. Such mental fortitude! Shenjiu steadied himself, then curled one of his fingers, testing. The sword on the ground, still soaked in a horrifying amount of blood, slowly rose in the air. It flew towards Shenjiu. As he stared at the blade, a peculiar expression of excitement bloomed on his face before he reached out and grabbed it firmly. He gave the sword a brandish, then left the study with the weapon. Shen Qingqiu stood in place for a while until the system sent him a notification. Gentle warning. Please stay locked on the plot hole filling target. We recommend staying within 10 meters of the target to guarantee full retrieval of the plot line. Wait, so not following the plot hole filling target meant potentially losing bits of story? Shen Qingqiu quickly followed after Shenjiu, not daring to fall a single step behind. Shenjiu had just turned a corner to meet 2 road-round, heavy-set guards. With a swing of his arm, a cold light flashed horizontally, slicing the 2 bloated, fleshy necks together. Blood sprayed as if from a fountain. Shenjiu killed nearly every person he saw, and the more he killed, the higher his spirits climbed. The sinister smile on his lips stretched wider and wider. Unceasing screams followed him everywhere as he cleanly and decisively cut down some 10 people. Shen Qingqiu noticed that he only killed men. Not a single woman fell under his blade. The female servants and maids were all huddled in a corner in the kitchen, but Shenjiu didn't go out of his way to execute them. With such clear discrimination between the sexes, he'd made the targets of his hatred extremely obvious. Shen Qingqiu was still watching, gripped with alarm and terror, when a sudden scream came from behind him. Qiu Haitang stood at the end of the hall, blankly staring in their direction. Blood splattered Shenjiu's body. He looked like a living ghost, one who was currently yanking his sword out of a guard's neck. Qiu Haitang's lovely face twitched several times. Then her eyes rolled back into her skull and she collapsed, falling straight back into a pool of blood. It seemed like this maiden had always been the type to faint in critical situations. Upon seeing Qiu Haitang, Shenjiu calmed down a little, and the arm holding his sword dropped to his side. After pondering for a moment, he headed toward the kitchen. Not long after that, a fire began to blaze. The dark clouds in the night sky above the Qiu Manor were suffused with a searing red, like the magma from purgatory. As Shenjiu dragged Qiu Haitang's body into the bushes outside, a person silently appeared behind him. Shenjiu grabbed his sword and quickly turned around, his eyes ferocious. But when he saw who it was, he breathed a sigh of relief. Senior. This senior must have been the one who'd set up the altar trial within the city, the one who'd kindled and fanned Shenjiu's treachery. Wu Yangzi. Wu Yangzi gave a soft chortle. Not killing everyone. Shenjiu was silent for a moment. Everyone who I wanted to kill is already dead. Actually, one of the points your brother made was correct. It's true you were born with talent, but the best age for cultivating is already behind you. Furthermore, due to the abuse you suffered under him, there's been some damage to your natural bases. A number of achievements should still be within your reach. But if you wish to become one of the best, that is no longer possible. A few years earlier and things would have been different. If this man had heard young Master Qiu's words, he must have watched the disastrous incident from beginning to end. Yet he had no intention of interfering and instead only watched on from the sidelines. It looked like this, quote, senior wasn't the especially gentle sort. If Shenjiu really did leave with him, he likely wouldn't walk a bright and just path either. Before, Shen Qingqiu had thought that this body's qualifications were already incredible. To have formed a core in only 10 or so years when he'd begun cultivation so late, he never would have predicted that Shen Qingqiu originally could have gone even further. Faced with this truth, even a person devoid of ambition like himself couldn't help but sigh and lament. So it wasn't hard to understand why the highly competitive original flavor had always brimmed with vindictive bitterness. After all, having something and losing it, as opposed to never having it at all, would leave a person even more resentful. Veins bulged on the back of Shen Jiu's sword hand. "That beast wasn't my brother," he said coldly. "Besides, did you offer me any other option?" That person had already turned around, but when he saw that Shen Jiu still standing before the Qiu Manor gates, he asked, "Not leaving now? Who are you waiting for?" That quote, "Who are you waiting for?" was a rhetorical question asked without meaning, intended only to urge him on. Shen Jiu turned his head to gaze at the towering inferno consuming the Qiu estate, and his eyes seemed to blaze along with it. The Qiu servants who'd been lucky enough to escape death scrambled and fell over one another as they fled. Amidst the wails and screams, only Shen Jiu's ash-white figure stood firmly before the gates, the red-gold flames behind him flickering and weaving in their wild dance. The fires of Qiu estate burned hotter and brighter, and the rafters lurched and collapsed. Faintly carved upon Shen Jiu's blackened, soot-covered cheek was a thin, pale track. He forcefully flung his sword forth, hurling it into the sea of flames, then turned around as well. 3 short words came from his mouth. "No more waiting." Shen Qingqiu had always known that the youth who promised to return to save him would never come back. It was only logical, wasn't it? This was a well-known flag, and together with the line, quote, "Let's get married in our hometown," was known as half of the, quote, "flag duo." If anyone vowed that they would, quote, "definitely come back" or "be back right away," it was guaranteed that you would never see so much as a shadow of them again. These 2 children really had been too naive, too optimistic. As long as Qi visited each sect one by one, he'd definitely find one willing to accept him. Completely wrong. Even if he did happen to get accepted and manage to succeed his studies after several years, he would have seen more of the world and gained many more things to worry about. So there was no guarantee that he'd return to look for his childhood companion. Furthermore, this martial arts world was unpredictable, and all kinds of disasters could unfold. Therefore, the chance of that youth actually returning to rescue Shen Jiu had been less than 5%. However, now the plot hole had been filled to this extent, Shen Qingqiu understood a little of why airplane shooting towards the sky had taken an axe to the outline. When written within the bounds of the original genre, this kind of character was extremely difficult to handle. You could say he was Scum, but he was also pitiful. But if he tried to acknowledge his pathos, his ruthlessness was real too. Characters that were both scummy and tragic always drew aggro, and they were a hotbed for wank, leading comment sections to devolve into massive flame wars. Better to hack him down into a formulaic asshole and let the protagonist step on him. Easier to write, and the readers would find it satisfying as well. Meanwhile, Qiu Haitang was completely innocent. All through that incident, she hadn't done anything wrong, but with a deep love came an equally deep hatred. It had ground a naive, pure-hearted girl down into a calculating, bitter, and vengeful woman. Her death in the holy mausoleum was even less deserved. If anything, her ending in the original Stallion novel had been happier. If only he could have given her a hand. back in the beginning. Shen Qingqiu was still sighing when the scene suddenly began to flash with black and white static like an old television. The setting and faces distorted into something unwatchable, while the sounds became crackling noise and gibberish. The system sent a notification. Incomplete memory warning. 5% of full dataset lost. 7% of full dataset lost. 9% of full dataset lost. The memory fragmentation was spreading further and further. As the percentage of data lost grew increasingly large, Shen Qingqiu violently smacked the notification window, just like how he'd helped, quote, fix the TV's poor connection when he was little. After a couple dozen smacks, it actually worked. When the percentage loss hit 10, the notification alarm abruptly ceased. The scene static vanished as well, becoming clear. Only then did Shen Qingqiu breathe a sigh of relief. He let go and backed up. He'd yet to stand properly when his eyes widened. Crouching only a couple of steps in front of him was a young boy. That fair and tender face was smeared with several streaks of dust, probably accidentally left there when wiping away his sweat. A red string was looped around his neck, a jade guanyin pendant dangling from it, and tied to his back was a ragged cloth bundle patterned with tiny flowers. Currently, he was diligently scratching at the ground in an attempt to dig a hole. 骆宾河, Shen Qingqiu blurted out. Little 骆宾河 didn't hear him and kept zealously digging his hole. When Shen Qingqiu looked around, he found they were in a vast canyon with hundreds of boys and girls of varying ages, dressed in all sorts of clothing. Each and every one was pouring all their efforts into digging holes. Understanding dawned on Shen Qingqiu. He raised his head and looked up. Sure enough, above the canyon loomed a steeply projected rock face. Upon it stood two people. One person was dressed in a dark-hued xuanduan robes, his bearing calm and composed. His focus was on the hundreds of people in the canyon below him. The other person wore a sword at his waist, and he twirled a folding fan between his fingers. Teal robes the color of emerald seas fluttered slightly in the wind. His face was subtly raised as he squinted downward, his attitude like that of one who couldn't be bothered with the ants beneath him. This was Yue Qingyuan and, quote Shen Qingqiu. And this was the scene of Changqiu Mountain's recruitment trial the year when Luo Binghe entered. Yes, you really didn't see wrong. The trial's objective was digging holes?